The woman known to history as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was born the Honourable Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon on the 4th of August 1900 at St Paul's, Waldenbury, a modest stately home near Hitchin in Hertfordshire, England. One of 10 children altogether, Elizabeth was the fourth and youngest daughter of Claude Bowes-Lyon, the Lord Glamis, who became the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. When her father inherited the Scottish earldom in 1904, she became Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The Bowes-Lyon family is descended from the Royal House of Scotland, with one of Elizabeth's 14th century ancestors becoming the Thane of Glamis, whose family seat was Glamis Castle, the setting of William Shakespeare's Macbeth, some 300 years earlier. Her mother was Lady Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck, a descendant of William Cavendish Bentinck, the 3rd Duke of Portland, and a former Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1783, and then of the United Kingdom between 1807 and 1809. Spending most of her childhood between Glamis Castle and St Paul's, Waldenbury, she engaged in field sports and enjoyed the company of dogs and horses. Of all her siblings, she was particularly close to her young brother David. There was only a 2-year age difference between them, and they were often inseparable and liked to play pranks on people together. Elizabeth was also extremely well educated due to her private tutoring at home, and by the age of 10, spoke French fluently. For a time, she was educated by a German Jewish governess, Käthe Kubler, and passed the Oxford local examination with distinction at the age of 13. The Great Britain in which Elizabeth grew up would have appeared to her peaceful and tranquil, and Elizabeth's status as a lady and as a member of the upper classes meant that she had a relatively easy life. Through the Victorian era, Great Britain had become one of the most advanced countries in the world thanks to its preeminence in trade and an empire that reached all 4 corners of the globe. However, it was not without momentous social and political change. Between 1910 and 1914, the Great Unrest, as it was termed, saw a mass upsurge in labour militancy and wave upon wave of strikes. 4,000 strikes were recorded involving around 4 million workers over that period, and trade union membership rose from 2 million to just over 4 million. Some actions were aggressive, violent, and insurgent. This was seen during the bitter South Wales coal strike in Tonypandy in 1910, the railway and dock strikes of 1911, and in a general strike of transport workers in Liverpool in the same year, which resulted in clashes between strikers and troops. Triggered by anger over poor wages, a 70-hour week and compulsory overtime, mass picketing at Llanelli railway station on the critical route from London to Ireland via the ferry at Fishguard was brutally suppressed by the police and troops. 2 men were shot dead and many others were wounded. The troops' action led to a day of widespread disorder and rioting. A movement to gain women's right to vote eventually succeeded through Acts of Parliament in 1918 and 1928. It had become a national movement during the Victorian era, with the formation of the National Society for Women's Suffrage founded in 1872. It remained largely ineffective, even after the creation of the more vocal National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, led by Millicent Fawcett, which still maintained it could achieve its aims through peaceful means. The campaign took on a more militant face with the establishment of the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia. These were the suffragettes whose tactics included parades, hunger strikes, stone throwing and smashing windows. In 1913, suffragette Emily Davison became a martyr to the cause by throwing herself under the King's horse at the Epsom Derby that year. While politics was put on hold at the start of the First World War, limited suffrage was, however, extended in 1918 not only to 8.4 million women, but also to 5.6 million disenfranchised men. 1928 saw legislation to extend suffrage to all men and women over the age of 21. Another crucial moment which would come to dominate British history and the life of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in the 20th century was the political situation in Ireland. A movement aimed at gaining self-government for the island of Ireland had become the dominant movement in Irish nationalism since the 1870s. Successive Home Rule bills championed by the Liberals have been defeated towards the end of the 19th century, either in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. A third attempt in 1912 was seen as only affecting moderate reforms and inflamed militant nationalists, eventually leading to the Easter Rising in 1916, the Irish War of Independence, and a treaty creating the Irish Free State with Dominion status in 1922, which allowed for the 6 counties of the north to remain part of the United Kingdom. The Irish Republic came into being in 1937. While these 3 issues dominated Elizabeth's early years, they would eventually be eclipsed by the outbreak of the First World War on the 4th of August 1914, her 14th birthday. During the war, her home of Glamis Castle became a convalescent hospital for troops who had been injured in the conflict, but who were expected to make a full recovery, and so did not need as much medical attention as other patients. Elizabeth was too young to become a nurse, but she did assist with welfare work, tending to wounded soldiers and helping with their rehabilitation, and, by all accounts, was very popular and well-liked. 4 of her older brothers served during the First World War. Her brother, Fergus, was an officer in the Scottish Black Watch Regiment but was wounded and killed in action during the 1915 Battle of Loos. Her brother Michael was also a soldier, and on the 28th of April 1917 was reported missing in action. It was later discovered that he had been wounded, taken captive, and moved to a prisoner of war camp, where he stayed until the end of the conflict. Strangely, one of the soldiers Elizabeth cared for wrote in her autograph book that she was to be hung, drawn and quartered, hung in diamonds, drawn in a coach and 4, and quartered in the best house in the land. By tradition, young women from noble and gentry families would be presented at court at the start of the social season. After being presented to the British sovereign, these débutantes, as they were called, were allowed to take part in all manner of balls, parties, and horse racing events, which was a sign that they were eligible for marriage. Elizabeth was presented to King George V in 1919. She was, however, no stranger to the royal family, with the children of the then King George and Queen Mary occasional visitors at her home at Glamis Castle in Scotland. In 1922, she acted as one of the bridesmaids at the wedding of their only daughter, Princess Mary, to the 6th Earl of Hereward, Henry Lascelles. During one such high society event, Elizabeth was introduced to Princess Mary's brother, Albert, known as Bertie within the family, and who at that time was second in line to the throne. Albert first proposed to her in 1921 when she was just 20 years old, but Elizabeth turned him down, fearing the restrictions that a royal marriage might bring to her life. Elizabeth did eventually accept his proposal, and on the 13th of January 1923, their engagement was publicly announced. Albert's choice of Elizabeth was seen at the time as the monarchy modernizing, as previously it was common for princes to marry members of other royal houses. Prince Albert and Lady Elizabeth were wed on the 26th of April 1923 in Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding to be held there since that of Anne of Bohemia to Richard II in 1382. Breaking with tradition, Elizabeth placed her wedding flowers on top of the tomb of the unknown warrior to honour her brother Fergus. Lady Elizabeth henceforth became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. After their wedding, she and Prince Albert quickly began to perform royal engagements together. Their first joint appearance after their wedding was at the RAF procession in Hendon held on the 30th of June 1923. One of the most significant royal engagements they had together, however, was in July 1924, when they visited Northern Ireland. Due to the success of this visit, the then Labour government decided that the couple should embark on a tour of East Africa from December 1924 to April 1925. However, in November 1924, the Conservatives defeated Labour in the general election against a backdrop of political unrest in what was then known as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, modern Sudan and South Sudan, which saw the assassination of the Governor-General, Sir Lee Stack. Despite this, Albert and Elizabeth decided to embark on their royal tour, visiting Aden, Uganda, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and Kenya, though they avoided Egypt due to political tensions. Around this time, Elizabeth encouraged her husband to see a speech therapist. All his life, Albert had dreaded making speeches because of a severe stammer. His closing speech at the British Empire exhibition in 1925 had proved a particular ordeal. The couple were introduced to an Australian speech therapist called Lionel Logue, who suggested daily hour-long vocal exercises which greatly reduced his stammer and gave him greater confidence in public speaking. Whenever Albert was due to make a speech, Logue was often called in, and he was regularly invited to the royal family's Christmas dinner to oversee the King's Christmas message. The relationship was later dramatized in the 2010 film The King's Speech, directed by Tom Hooper, and which starred Geoffrey Rush as Logue, Colin Firth as King George VI, and Helena Bonham Carter in the role of Elizabeth. On the 21st of April 1926, their first child, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, later to become Queen Elizabeth II, was born. Shortly after their daughter's birth, Albert and Elizabeth embarked on another royal tour, leaving their newborn daughter behind. It's known that Elizabeth greatly struggled with leaving their daughter behind, but their tour to Australia, Jamaica, Fiji, and back via the Panama Canal was regarded at home as a great success for public relations. 4 years later, their second daughter, Princess Margaret Rose, was born on the 21st of August 1930. Margaret was born in Glamis Castle and was the first royal baby to be born in Scotland since 1600. The registration of her birth was delayed to avoid Margaret being the 13th name in the parish register, which was seen as a bad luck omen. On the 20th of January 1936, King George V passed away from chronic bronchitis, and his popular eldest son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, succeeded to the throne to become King Edward VIII, starting a brief reign that would be marred with controversy and disapproval towards his love life, a situation which would haunt Elizabeth's life forever. As Prince of Wales, Edward had started a friendship with an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. He was known to be deeply in love with her. While the relationship was widely reported in the United States and in European newspapers, it was largely kept out of the British press by arm-twisting by the government of the day. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had attempted to persuade the king to give up the relationship and explored the possibility of a morganatic marriage whereby Wallis would not become queen and any children would not accede. This was ultimately rejected by Baldwin and the Prime Ministers of Australia, South Africa and Canada. Ultimately, Edward VIII chose to abdicate, addressing the nation by radio to say that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. On the 10th of December 1936, in front of Albert and their two other brothers, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. Thereafter, he flew to the continent, where he eventually married Wallis Simpson. On the 11th of December 1936, the man who was never meant to be king, Prince Albert, became King George VI, and Elizabeth became Queen Consort. Their coronation took place on the 12th of May 1937, the same day that Edward was due to have been crowned. Elizabeth was now Queen of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions, as well as the Empress of India. The scandal regarding Edward VIII was far from over, however. While Elizabeth was still supportive of her husband's decision to allow Edward to create his elder brother Duke of Windsor and to retain the title of Royal Highness on the advice of the cabinet, Wallis was not to be given this title, a decision which was said to have saddened the new king. However, there was no love lost between Elizabeth and Wallis. Wallis reportedly referred to Elizabeth as Cookie, believing that she was similar in appearance to a fat Scottish cook, and Elizabeth was known to simply call Wallis that woman. Elizabeth remained bitter that the abdication had forced her husband onto the throne reluctantly and unprepared. She also remained convinced that these events had ultimately shortened her husband's life, leaving her a relatively young widow. In the spring of 1938, the political climate across Europe was tense and talk of war was common. A royal tour of France was organized to cement relations between Britain and France in the face of potential German aggression. 5 days before the royal couple's departure, the Queen's mother, the Countess of Strathmore, died. The trip to France was postponed, and the court went into 3 weeks' mourning and dressed in black, to be replaced after a few weeks by grey and then mauve after that. The Queen's couturier, Norman Hartnell, had already devised a wardrobe for the trip to France in pastel colours and floral patterns, which was now regarded as entirely inappropriate. Thinking on his feet, he came up with what's become known as the white wardrobe, white having been the colour of deepest mourning among medieval queens. French queens had traditionally worn white in mourning, and the king's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, had been buried in white. The team had 2 weeks to prepare the costumes, which were favourably received in France and turned the Queen into an unlikely style icon. In March 1938, the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler annexed neighbouring Austria in a process known as the Anschluss. He then turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, where around 3 million people in the Sudetenland region spoke German. Neither Britain nor France felt ready to defend Czechoslovakia against the Germans and were anxious to avoid military intervention at any cost. Both countries believed that peace could only be maintained by making territorial concessions. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, proposed a 4-power conference in Munich to discuss the situation, at which Hitler promised to find peaceful means to resolve differences within Europe. Chamberlain returned to London pledging peace in our time. The royal family and the Prime Minister had always had a close relationship, and after the signing of the Munich Agreement on the 30th of September 1938, Neville Chamberlain joined the King and Elizabeth on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the first Prime Minister to ever do this, and received rapturous cheers from the crowd. This sense of unity and patriotism was to be short-lived. Chamberlain and the actions he took against Hitler may have been popular with the public, but politically this was regarded as a different matter. Elizabeth had been wholly supportive of Chamberlain and had agreed that Hitler must be dealt with delicately, but the House of Commons were highly critical of Chamberlain's solution. Following the 1938 Munich Agreement, both Britain and France quickly moved to rearm, with many believing that war with Germany was now inevitable. From May to June that year, King George and Elizabeth embarked on a tour of Canada and the United States. This was the first time reigning monarchs had embarked on a tour of the country. During the trip, a veteran from the Boer War asked Elizabeth whether she considered herself Scottish or English, to which she replied that she was a Canadian. This response and the tour in general were extremely successful and changed the public perception of King George and Elizabeth, many of whom had believed the couple to be less suitable to royal life than Edward VIII. Speaking to the then Canadian Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, Elizabeth expressed her belief that the Canadian tour was the making of George and Elizabeth as King and Queen, and that she would continue to return to Canada often throughout the rest of her life, whether that be a visit for work or pleasure. This transatlantic tour was seen not only as an opportunity to assert British dominion over Canada, but also as a means of ensuring American support and involvement in the event of war in Europe. While in the United States, the royal couple spent some time with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, even staying with them at the White House and their residence in the Hudson Valley. The American First Lady reportedly spoke highly of Elizabeth and considered her a suitable and capable monarch and queen. By the early part of 1939, Hitler had become determined to invade Poland. In a cat's cradle of alliances, Britain and France had pledged to support Poland if it should be attacked by Germany. Meanwhile, in secret negotiations, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Russia, agreeing to share Poland after the invasion. The scene was set for war. Germany invaded Poland on the 31st of August 1939, prompted by a false flag attack, and a day later, Britain declared war on Germany. A massive evacuation plan was ordered, to take civilians, mainly children, away from the cities and ports in an operation called Pied Piper. Public air raid shelters were built, with millions of so-called Anderson shelters set up in people's gardens. After the surrender of France in June 1940, England remained as Germany's sole enemy, and Hitler planned to undertake an amphibious invasion, ordering the Luftwaffe to establish complete dominance in the skies over England in preparation. War came to London in earnest on the 7th of September, when hundreds of German bombers and fighter planes descended on London in what became known as the Blitz. The operation lasted for 57 nights in a row. The targets for the bombers were principally in the East End of London and the docks, but very few parts of the capital escaped, with Buckingham Palace bombed on at least 9 occasions. The King and Queen refused to leave the country during the Blitz despite the inherent dangers and as obvious targets for enemy action. Elizabeth insisted also that her daughters should remain too, against the advice that they should be sent to Canada. In a letter to Queen Mary, Elizabeth described one bomb attack on the palace which saw a direct hit in the quadrangle and the destruction of the palace chapel. She spoke of her pride in the behavior of the servants. Just a short time later, in an act which was to enamor the King and Queen to the British people, she visited a bomb site in West Ham, where she spoke of walking in a dead city, all the houses evacuated, and yet through the broken windows one saw all the poor little possessions, photographs, beds, just as they were left. During the Blitz, the royal couple were seen as key in keeping up morale and helping the war effort. They came to be seen as the embodiment of the struggle against fascism and as a reminder of what the British were fighting for. Rejecting the advice to flee to safety abroad, Elizabeth was quoted as saying, "The children will not leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does, and the King will not leave the country in any circumstances." Queen Elizabeth contributed to the war effort in many other ways. For example, she sponsored the publication of the Queen's Book of the Red Cross. Appearing in November 1939, this book aimed to help the funding for the Red Cross during the war. Its authors included A. Milne, who wrote the Winnie the Pooh stories, the novelist Daphne du Maurier, and the poet T.S. Eliot, and included photography by a close friend of the royal family, Cecil Beaton, along with artwork by Arthur Ragg. Using her position and role as a caring and doting mother, Elizabeth would also take part in radio broadcasts and try to comfort and help encourage families that had been separated during the war, whether it was children who had been evacuated to the countryside or fathers who were fighting overseas. Many members of the staff working at Buckingham Palace were fighting in the army, so Elizabeth and her husband would spend their days at Buckingham Palace, but then leave for Windsor Castle later in the day. This was both for their own personal safety and to be closer to their family. Elizabeth was always known for being an extremely hard-working royal, and this was evident even during the Second World War. Elizabeth would visit troops, factories, hospitals, and any other places that were targeted by the German Luftwaffe. She also paid numerous visits to the East End of London. Despite Elizabeth's best intentions, these planned visits did not always go down well with the crowd. Elizabeth was sometimes met with hostility, especially regarding her fashion choices in a time of war. The people of the East End found Elizabeth's choice of brightly coloured and clearly expensive clothes to be distasteful and a clear representation of the separation between Elizabeth and them. However, Elizabeth and her stylist Norman Hartnell had deliberately chosen to not wear black, as it was felt that black was reminiscent of funerals and could be seen as a bleak and depressing colour. She regarded the colours she wore as a token of hope. After Buckingham Palace was bombed, Elizabeth stated that she was almost relieved as she believed she could now be seen as an equal to those living in the East End. Elizabeth's actions and sense of duty during the war, and the significance of her being a wartime queen, remains one of the things she is fondly remembered for. Édouard Daladier, the French wartime Prime Minister, held Elizabeth in high esteem and was impressed by her conduct as Queen and the support and encouragement she gave to her husband and the people of her country. It's believed that Hitler believed the same, describing her as the most dangerous woman in Europe, and describing her popularity as a threat to German interests. And so, despite her wariness and disapproval of the conflict, many historians regard her character and actions as key and central to the winning of the Second World War, as was the strong bond that developed between her, the King, and Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister after the resignation of Neville Chamberlain in May 1940. The Second World War came to an end on the 2nd of September 1945. In the general election that followed shortly afterwards, there was a surprise defeat for Britain's wartime leader Winston Churchill, and a Labour government was returned under Clement Attlee, triggering a period of considerable social change, most notably the creation of the welfare state. The political views of the British royal family, in the past century at least, have been a closely guarded secret, and whilst it can never be fully known where Elizabeth's true political beliefs and alliances lay, many historians do believe that she was one of the most supportive conservative monarchs. However, it is rumoured that Elizabeth had told her close friend, the British politician and journalist Woodrow Wyatt, that she liked and was fond of the Labour Party, despite the popular historical belief that Elizabeth thought that only the poor and uneducated voted for Labour. Elizabeth had also told her family member, the Duchess of Grafton, that she actually loved the Communists. However, Elizabeth wasn't always the perfect royal. Whilst the King, Elizabeth and their children were touring South Africa in 1947, Elizabeth mistook one of their admirers' excitement at seeing the royal family as an act of attempted violence, and, as a result, hit him with her umbrella from the royal car. However, this is regarded as the only incident of Elizabeth breaking royal protocol and acting unprofessionally. This same year, 1947, saw her eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, marry Prince Philip, a former Prince of Greece and Denmark. Philip had been corresponding with her daughter since she was 13 years of age in 1939, and after serving in the Royal Navy during the war, asked the King for his daughter's hand in marriage in 1946. The King consented, but asked for the engagement to be delayed until Princess Elizabeth's 21st birthday. The ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November, 1947. Some biographers have suggested that Elizabeth and other members of the royal family had disapproved of Philip's relationship with Princess Elizabeth, partially because his sisters had married German noblemen who had Nazi links, but also because he was without financial means. His family had been exiled from Greece after his uncle was forced to abdicate for military failures during the Greco-Turkish War in 1922. Elizabeth is believed to have initially teased Philip by giving him the nickname the Hun, though later conceded that he was indeed an English gentleman. Following the wedding, the King and Queen were due to embark on another royal tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1948, but the trip had to be delayed due to the King's deteriorating health. In their public broadcast to the nation in April 1948, celebrating their silver wedding anniversary, the King thanked his consort Elizabeth and spoke very highly of her and of her constant support throughout their marriage. That year, George VI had to stop public appearances for a period of time because of a pain that he felt in his right leg and foot, one that the doctors believed to be thromboangiitis obliterans, also known as Buerger disease. His case, where his arteries had become severely hardened and had become swollen, was so severe that amputation had been considered. On the 12th of March 1949, the King endured a procedure known as a right lumbar sympathectomy, an injection given in his leg to relieve him of his pain by blocking the sympathetic nerves in the leg. While both the King and Elizabeth were dealing with these issues surrounding his health, they also became grandparents on the 14th of November 1948, when Prince Charles was born to Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Throughout the remainder of her life, Elizabeth would share an incredibly close bond with her grandson and was central to encouraging him in his passion for the arts and culture. Even though King George VI appeared to be recovering and seemed to be in better health, it was Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip who embarked on the royal tour of Canada in place of the King and Queen in October 1951, the princesses' first tour of Canada. This was a year after the birth of their daughter, Princess Anne, on the 15th of August 1950. The King's last public appearance with his wife Elizabeth was in May 1951, when they opened the Festival of Britain together in front of an audience of 3,000 people. This festival was aimed at restoring patriotism and pride in being British, as well as being a celebration of the end of rationing and victory in the Second World War. However, just a few months later, on the 23rd of September 1951, the King underwent a pneumonectomy, the removal of his left lung at home in Buckingham Palace after a lung cancer diagnosis, which was due to his heavy smoking. By December, the King had somewhat recovered, although in his Christmas Day address on the 25th of December 1951, it was clear that his speech sounded slower and his voice was deeper than usual, although this was most likely due to the removal of his left recurrent laryngeal nerve during the surgery, which can affect the sound of one's voice. Whilst the King was attempting to make a full recovery in the hope of resuming his royal duties, his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and her husband, Philip, embarked on another royal tour of the Commonwealth, this time taking in Kenya, New Zealand, and Australia, starting in January 1952. Before they left for this royal tour, Albert had decided to wave them off at London Airport before their departure, despite medical advice not to. This was the last time that Elizabeth would ever see her father, and it was the King's last ever public appearance. The British public had been kept in the dark about the health battle facing the King, and so for many it was a shock to see George VI looking so ill on the newsreels in the cinema. On the 6th of February 1952, King George VI passed away in his sleep. The royal physician, Dr. James Ansell, declared that the king had died from a coronary thrombosis. It was believed that Ansell had not been aware of the king's cancer diagnosis due to the level of privacy surrounding the royal family. Indeed, the actual cause of the king's death was never actually made public. The press reported that the king died from a blood clot in his heart. Princess Elizabeth was given the news of her father's death while she was at the Treetops Resort in Kenya by her husband, Prince Philip, on the 6th of February 1952. She was now Queen Elizabeth, and her mother was to be known henceforth as Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a title by which she is best known today. Elizabeth initially struggled with the death of her husband and chose to retire from royal life and duties. Not only had she lost her husband, but also her role in public life, along with her husband's many royal houses: Buckingham Palace, Sandringham in Norfolk, and Balmoral in Scotland. It was decided that she should move out of Buckingham Palace into Clarence House, a modest residence which it's understood she disliked intensely, but she also chose to buy a house on the west coast of Scotland as a retirement home. It was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who visited her that summer in Balmoral to urge her not to retreat from public life, as Queen Victoria had done after the death of her beloved husband, Albert. Churchill was keen that she should be on hand to support her daughter as she navigated her new role as Queen. Subsequently, she resumed royal duties, attending functions and openings, and flew to the United States to receive a check for the George VI Memorial Fund. She became a patron to more than 300 organizations and made history by becoming the first female Chancellor of London University and the first female Lord Warden and Admiral of the Cinque Ports. However, her principal role was very much as a supportive and encouraging influence on her daughters. The Queen Mother remained especially close to her daughter Margaret, and due to their special bond, they both embarked on a royal tour of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which later became Zimbabwe, Zambia and Malawi, from the 1st of July to the 16th of July 1953. This was the Queen Mother's first international visit since the state funeral of her husband on the 14th of February 1952 at Westminster Hall. Even though this royal tour was originally scheduled to be carried out by Princess Elizabeth, the tour was regarded as a great success. The visit to the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland is regarded as a key moment in her onward career as a royal figure and kicked off a new chapter in her royal life. During this tour, the Queen Mother placed the foundation stone for the University College of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, now the University of Zimbabwe. In 1957, she became the university's president and would often attend their events when possible. Despite her support for education in Africa, there are persistent suggestions that the Queen Mother held racist views. However, whether they went beyond those prevalent in society at the time is uncertain. Some historians and biographers of the Queen Mother report her support for racial segregation, apartheid, and white supremacy in Rhodesia. She has even been accused of supporting the Empire and the British rule over African countries, which she believed were not able to rule themselves. On the other hand, a former equerry to the Queen Mother, Major Colin Burgess, has denied the suggestion that the Queen Mother ever made racial insults and slurs, although he does report in his book, Behind Palace Doors, that she was often ignorant of current affairs. Furthermore, the Queen Mother never publicly voiced offensive views, if indeed she held them, and so it is difficult to prove the veracity of the claims. The British historian and a former Conservative, Sir Robert Rhodes-James, has said that the Queen Mother had told him that she did not agree with discrimination regarding race and opposed apartheid. While her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was finding her feet, she still commanded enormous respect in the royal household. At the start of the new Queen's first royal tour of the Commonwealth as monarch, from 1953 to 1954, the Queen Mother remained in Britain and acted as the Counsellor of State. This meant that, as a more senior member of the royal family, the Queen Mother carried out many of the duties commonly done by the reigning monarch, such as signing official documents and carrying on royal business in the monarch's absence. The Queen Mother's fondness for Scotland is undisputed. After being widowed in 1952, she had bought the partially derelict Barrowgill Castle and its surrounding estate and planned to restore the building so it could be used as her holiday home. From the years 1953 to 1960, much work was done on the castle, including the plastering and supply of electricity and water, which was the first time the castle had had these resources. From 1955 until her death, the Queen Mother would visit the Barrowgill Castle for 3 weeks in August and for almost a fortnight in October. She was said to visit this castle as an opportunity for escapism and peace, away from the distractions of life in London. One such distraction was her youngest daughter Margaret's controversial relationship with former Battle of Britain pilot, Group Captain Peter Townsend. Townsend had served as King George VI's equerry or assistant from 1944 until the King's death and had been kept on by the new Queen. Peter Townsend was also appointed as the comptroller to the Queen Mother in 1952, which meant that he was charged with overseeing the spending of her royal household. According to several sources, Princess Margaret first met Peter Townsend when she was 14, but the romance only began 8 years later, after the death of her father. The group captain was 16 years older than Margaret, and later confessed that he had been attracted to her intense beauty and sense of humour. The relationship had been kept from the public eye, but an off-guard moment at the Queen's coronation, where Margaret was seen to pick some fluff off the group captain's uniform, fueled speculation in the international press. Townsend had served in the Indian Civil Service, and when he returned to Britain, he'd married Cecil Rosemary Pratt, Marchioness of Camden, after a short engagement, and the couple had had 2 sons. After his wife's infidelity, he filed for divorce. It was his status as a divorcee that made it impossible for him to marry Margaret, as it was against the teachings of the Church of England. Parliament was also firmly against the union. As defender of the faith, the head of the Church of England, her sister, the Queen, was unable to sanction the relationship. A compromise was proposed. Under the terms of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, no descendant of George II could marry without the permission of the reigning monarch. It was suggested that Margaret and Peter Townsend wait until the princess turned 25 years of age and was thus deemed to be capable of making her own decisions. Townsend was posted to Brussels as an air attaché at the British Embassy, but even by the time of Margaret's 25th birthday, the Queen had still not given her approval for the marriage. Despite changing attitudes and a lingering sadness among the British public that Edward VIII had been unable to marry for love and retain his royal status, permission was still not given. The Prime Minister of the time, Anthony Eden, was himself a divorcee and had subsequently remarried, and one might expect that he would be sympathetic to the princess's plight. Eden did amend the Royal Marriages Act, but in a way that was regarded as cruel and unfair. The change would have allowed Margaret and Townshend's marriage, but the princess and their future children would be removed from the line of succession as a result. Whilst Eden did highlight that Margaret's removal from the succession would not affect her status as a royal in any way, in the end, Margaret chose not to marry Townshend. On the 31st of October 1955, Princess Margaret made her position clear that she was mindful of the teachings of the Church and was conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, and that she had decided to put these considerations before any others. Margaret was said to be heartbroken, but ultimately moved on. Despite tension and friction between her daughters, the Queen Mother lived a rather peaceful, private life as a widow. Her love for field sports and animals continued throughout her life, and now, as Queen Mother, she had more time to dedicate to these passions. A deep affection for horses was a love shared between the whole family, as her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was also an avid admirer, and she developed a new interest in steeplechasing, a race in which horses must jump over various fences and terrain obstacles. This fascination with the sport came as a result of her friendship with Anthony Bingham Mildmay, the second Baron Mildmay of Fleet, who was an amateur steeplechaser. He sat next to the Queen Mother at a dinner in Windsor Palace in 1949, where he struck up a conversation with the then Queen, in which he recommended that Elizabeth should buy a horse that she could share with her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. With the help of Mildmay's trainer, Peter Cazalet, the horse Monaveen was selected for the Royals, and this horse won its first race at the Fontwell Park Racecourse in October 1949, where it won the Chichester Handicap race. The Queen Mother's horses won 500 steeplechase races, and she was an avid follower of every steeplechase race, even having the commentaries piped directly to her place of residence in Clarence House, although it is unclear whether she actually placed bets on these races or not. As well as a love for horses, the Queen Mother also enjoyed angling. In 1982, after nearly choking on a fish bone and having to have the stuck bone removed surgically at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, she joked that that incident was simply an act of revenge by the salmon she had caught. Another lifelong interest was collecting various artworks. Whilst she acquired most of her large collection during her time as reigning monarch, she was always continually adding to her collection of art and often developed a close bond with her favourite artists, such as John Piper or Edward Seago. She also had a liking for artwork that had been inspired by previous royals, such as the sketches made by the Scottish painter Sir David Wilkie for his portrait of Queen Victoria in her youth. She was also supportive of artists who had been active in the Second World War. Among many other works, her collection included paintings by Monet and Augustus John, and a number of Fabergé eggs. It was not long before the love life of Elizabeth's daughter Margaret took centre stage again. In the late 50s, she embarked on an initially scandalous affair with a photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones. Once again, the liaison was kept secret from the public, and yet there are suggestions that the Queen Mother not only knew about her daughter's affair, but actively encouraged it. At the time, Margaret shared Windsor's Royal Lodge with her mother, and it's been reported by biographers that the Queen Mother grew fond of the photographer, whom she dubbed Tony. Soon, Margaret was paying secret visits to Armstrong-Jones's studio in Pimlico, and he was a frequent visitor to the lodge in Windsor. He did so under cover of building an aviary for the Queen Mother. In 1959, the Queen Mother threw a party to welcome Princess Alexandra home from Australia, at which it was clear that Margaret and Anthony Armstrong-Jones had feelings for one another. They would marry a year later in a ceremony which was the first of its kind to be televised. On the 6th of October 1961, Armstrong-Jones was given the title of the Earl of Snowdon. On the 28th of May 1960, a few weeks after his marriage to Margaret, Armstrong-Jones's illegitimate daughter, Polly Fry, was born. She was subsequently brought up by a close friend of the Snowdons, and it wasn't until 2004 that she persuaded Lord Snowdon to have a DNA test which confirmed their link. From his marriage to Princess Margaret, the Queen Mother had two more grandchildren, David Armstrong-Jones, the second Earl of Snowdon, on the 3rd of November 1961, and Lady Sarah Armstrong-Jones, now Lady Sarah Chatto, on the 1st of May 1964. Nevertheless, Margaret and Anthony had a turbulent marriage, with widespread rumours of adultery and drug use. While it's accepted generally that Anthony was the first to be unfaithful, Margaret went on to have affairs of her own. The couple divorced in 1978 in what was the first royal divorce since the annulment of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540. The Queen Mother maintained a close relationship with Armstrong-Jones, and it was believed that many members of the royal family supported him after their divorce. Increasingly, the Queen Mother encountered ill health. In February of 1964, she underwent an emergency appendectomy, which led to the postponement of her planned royal tour of the Commonwealth countries of Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji for 2 years. After the procedure, the Queen Mother recovered aboard the Britannia, the royal family's cherished yacht, during a Caribbean cruise. She would have 2 battles with cancer, with the first in December 1966, when she underwent an operation to remove a cancerous tumour after her colon cancer diagnosis. In 1984, the Queen Mother was diagnosed with cancer for the second time. She was then given a diagnosis of breast cancer, which resulted in the removal of a lump in her breast. The public was not made aware of these health challenges at the time. Indeed, these issues with her health did not stop her from undertaking her royal duties, and she continued to be one of the most hard-working royals for the rest of her life. She embarked on over 40 official royal overseas visits, notably visiting Iran in 1975 at the invitation of the country's last monarch, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. She was warmly received there, and it was reported that many were amused by the fact that the Queen Mother would engage in conversation with anyone, regardless of their hierarchy or status. Despite her busy schedule, time was always set aside for leisure. Between 1976 and 1984, she would visit France to spend her summer there every year, and she would embark on her own private trips to other European countries up until 1992. In 1981, the Queen Mother's favourite grandson, Charles, married Lady Diana Spencer. Diana's grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had been one of the Queen Mother's ladies-in-waiting since 1956, and Diana blamed her for turning the Queen Mother against her. Princess Diana once told a friend in a secretly taped conversation that her husband's grandmother was always looking at me with a strange look in her eyes. She described it as interest and pity mixed in one. One issue that Diana reportedly found particularly galling was how the Queen Mother was demonstratively preferential towards her eldest son, Prince William, over her younger son, Harry. Later documentaries would claim that the Queen Mother would invite Prince William over for tea and not invite Prince Harry. In later life, however, she seems to have favoured Harry over William, leaving him a larger share of her estate than his elder brother. After Princess Diana's death in a car crash in Paris in 1997, the Queen Mother was said to have been upset at the criticism levelled at her daughter the Queen for being uncaring and insensitive to the mood of the nation. In 1987, a major controversy was revealed surrounding the Queen Mother, one that impacted her popularity to some degree. It was revealed that her nieces, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, had been wrongly listed as dead by Burke's Peerage, a yearly publication of aristocratic genealogy and heraldry, in 1963, claiming that Nerissa had died in 1940 and Catherine in 1961. In 1987, the tabloid newspaper, The Sun, published an article proving Burke's Peerage as wrong, and instead informing the public the Queen Mother's nieces were instead living in the Royal Earlswood Hospital for People with Mental Disabilities since 1941. Both were classified as imbeciles in the terminology of the day. The paper revealed that neither Nerissa nor Catherine had ever learned how to talk, and they had essentially been cut off and ignored by their family, other than a yearly payment of £125 to Earlswood Hospital. When Nerissa passed away in 1986, no family reportedly attended her funeral. There have been mixed accounts regarding this controversial chapter in the Queen Mother's life. A documentary produced by Channel 4 in 2011, titled The Queen's Hidden Cousins, included claims made by nurses who worked at the hospital at that time that no members of the royal family, nor the Bowes-Lyon family, ever visited the girls. However, sources within the family argue otherwise. They maintain that the two sisters were often visited by their mother, Fenella Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's sister-in-law, until she died in 1966. It has also been claimed that the Queen Mother also began to develop a relationship with her nieces after learning that they were actually still alive in 1982 and would send them money for presents at Christmas time and on each of their birthdays. There has been no official confirmation of this. Throughout her life, the Queen Mother was heavily involved with charity work and became patron of MenCap, supporting those with learning disabilities in 1986. On the 4th of August 1990, the Queen Mother celebrated her 90th birthday. The landmark was commemorated publicly on the 27th of June 1990 with a parade thanking her for her service and endurance as one of the longest and hardest working members of the royal family. For her 100th birthday, 10 years later, another parade was hosted to celebrate her life and achievements. Actors such as Sir John Mills and Sir Norman Wisdom participated, and the Royal Bank of Scotland produced a special £20 banknote to celebrate this momentous occasion. However, the Queen Mother's health was quickly failing, although this did not prevent her from carrying out royal duties. Despite injuring her pelvis in December 2001, she refused to sit for the national anthem for her husband's memorial service on the 6th of February 2002 as a mark of respect for a beloved husband. Tragedy struck for the Queen Mother on the 9th of February 2002, just 3 days after the anniversary of her husband's passing, with the death of her youngest daughter, Princess Margaret, after suffering from her 4th stroke. Members of the royal family and the Queen herself were concerned about the Queen Mother making the journey from her place of residence in Norfolk to St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where Margaret was to be buried, but she flew there by helicopter, partially so no press would be able to take photographs of her in her wheelchair, which she did not like to use. Her last public appearance was on the 5th of March 2002, when the Queen Mother attended a garden lunch party for the Eton Beagles, a hunting society at the prestigious Eton School. On the 30th of March 2002, the Queen Mother passed away with her eldest daughter at her side at the age of 101. At the time of her death, she was the longest living member of the British royal family in history. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was laid in state for 3 days at Westminster Hall, and it's calculated that 200,000 people paid their respects to her there before her funeral on the 9th of April 2002. Her death was also marked in the Commonwealth, with the then Governor-General of Canada, Adrienne Clarkson, asking Canadian citizens to remember the Queen Mother and honour their memory of her on the day of her funeral. The Queen Mother was laid to rest beside her husband and their daughter Margaret in St. George's Chapel, and, after her funeral, her wreath was placed on top of the grave of the unknown soldier upon her request, a repeat of her gesture at her wedding some 79 years before. The Queen Mother had a major impact on Britain throughout her life and reign, and it was her stable and loving marriage with King George VI and the support she provided him that has often been credited as saving the British monarchy in a time of immense social and political upheaval. Upon her death, the Queen Mother was remembered as kind and funny, and was one of the more liked members of the royal family, and this has only been furthered by her depiction in the popular Netflix drama The Crown. What do you think about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother? Do you think she was the saving grace of the British monarchy? Or were her rumoured racist views and neglect of her nieces an insight into her true character? Please, let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.